The letter from the HOA was clear. Vacate the premises immediately. But for Dr. Marcus Thorne, this wasn't just about a property line. It was the third warning this month, each more absurd than the last, each delivered only to him, the only black homeowner on the block. He stood on his own porch, the deed in his hand, as the faux official HOA patrol car rolled to a stop at his curb. The man who stepped out, clipboard in hand, had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought he was evicting a nuisance. He was about to trigger a storm that would expose the rotten core of this picture-perfect community. Because Dr. Thorne wasn't just a homeowner, he was a hunter, and they had just cornered the most dangerous predator of all. If you believe in standing up to injustice, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story where the good guy wins. The serenity of Pinecrest Estates was a carefully manufactured illusion. Manicured lawns stretched like emerald carpets, each nearly identical house standing in silent, respectful rows. For Dr. Marcus Thorne, this quiet order was the entire point. After 2 decades at the FBI, navigating the chaotic underbelly of international crime syndicates, he had craved stillness. The house on Willow Creek Lane was his sanctuary, a reward for a career spent in shadows. He'd chosen Pinecrest not for its prestige, but for its promise of peace. Marcus was a man of disciplined routine, a reflection of his training. Mornings were for coffee on his back deck, overlooking a small, pristine lake. Evenings were for quiet reading, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of a neighbor's luxury car pulling into a garage. He kept to himself, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose quiet demeanor could be mistaken for aloofness, but his sharp, analytical eyes missed nothing. He noticed the subtle shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere shortly after he moved in. It began with the looks, not overtly hostile but lingering. A woman walking her poodle would cross the street just before reaching his property. A neighbor washing his car would pause, hose in hand, and just watch as Marcus checked his mail. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the natural curiosity about a new resident. But the curiosity never warmed into welcome. The first official notice arrived 6 weeks after he'd settled in. It was slipped into his door jamb, a crisp, formal letter on HOA letterhead. It cited a violation of community standards. His trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. A petty, almost laughable offense. Marcus had simply forgotten to wheel them back after the truck came by. He paid the $50 fine online without a second thought, chalking it up to the overzealousness of suburban governance. But the notices kept coming. A second one arrived, citing the unapproved color of his welcome mat, a deep burgundy that supposedly clashed with the community's earth-tone palette. Then a third, warning him that the excessive height of the ornamental grasses in his front flower bed violated the low-profile landscaping bylaws. The grasses were the same ones the previous owner had planted. Marcus had merely maintained them. Each citation felt increasingly targeted, a needle seeking a vein of irritation. He started to pay closer attention. He observed that Mr. Henderson, 3 doors down, had a bright turquoise welcome mat that had never prompted a letter. The Johnsons across the street frequently left their trash cans out for an entire day with no consequence. The pattern was subtle, but to a man whose career was built on profiling and recognizing patterns, it was becoming unmistakable. The antagonist of this quiet campaign was the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association, presided over by a man named Harold Finch. Finch was a retired insurance adjuster who had found his true calling in the micromanagement of other people's lives. He patrolled the neighborhood in a golf cart modified with a magnetic placard that read HOA Security, a self-appointed sheriff of shrubbery and shingle colors. Marcus had seen him only in passing, a thin, pinched-faced man with a perpetual frown, who seemed to derive immense satisfaction from the power of his clipboard. The conflict was still a low hum, a distant thundercloud on a clear day. Marcus Thorne, the man who had faced down armed cartel leaders and unraveled complex financial crimes, was not yet concerned with a petty bureaucrat and a few fines. He was home. This was his castle, his hard-earned peace. But Harold Finch, from behind the wheel of his ridiculous golf cart, was preparing to lay siege to those very walls, unaware that the fortress he was threatening was guarded by a sleeping dragon. This channel is dedicated to stories of justice. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you're here for the next victory. The low hum of harassment soon became a deafening siren. The fines, once sporadic, began arriving with the grim regularity of a metronome. Each day's mail brought a fresh envelope from the Pinecrest Estates HOA, each citation more absurd than the last. The unapproved welcome mat was just the beginning. Now the violation was for the unauthorized placement of a single modest potted fern on his front step. Another letter condemned the excessive wear on his driveway pavement, a faint crack that had existed long before Marcus purchased the home. The stated fines were escalating, but the real cost was to his peace. Marcus, a man who operated on evidence, began to document everything. He took time-stamped photographs of his neighbors' properties. He saw Mrs. Gable with 3 identical ferns on her steps. He saw the Patterson family with a driveway network of cracks that looked like a spider web. None of them received citations. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was a glaring neon sign pointing directly at his house, the only one on the block with a black owner. The confrontation shifted from paper to person. Harold Finch began to make his presence known. Marcus would be watering his lawn, and the white golf cart would silently glide to a halt at the curb. Finch would sit there, clipboard in hand, not speaking, just observing, his expression a mask of smug authority. It was a psychological game, a tactic designed to intimidate. To a civilian, it might have been unnerving. To Marcus, it was amateur hour, a transparent play from the handbook of petty tyranny. But the stakes were raised dramatically on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus had just returned from a consulting trip to Quantico. Parked in his driveway was a bright yellow pickup truck. 2 men in work uniforms were on his roof, beginning to pry up the perfectly functional HOA-approved shingles. Marcus's blood ran cold. He strode across the lawn, his voice a low, commanding roll that stopped the workers in their tracks. "What is happening on my roof?" he demanded. One of the men, looking confused, handed him a work order. It was authorized by the Pinecrest Estates HOA. It stated that the homeowner's roof was discolored and detrimental to community aesthetics, and was being replaced at the homeowner's expense. The cost listed was astronomical. Marcus felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. This was no longer about ferns or welcome mats. This was a direct, brazen assault on his property. He called Harold Finch immediately. The man's voice was dripping with condescending satisfaction. "Dr. Thorne," the board voted, "your roof is an eyesore. We're simply upholding the standards that protect everyone's property values." "You will call these men off my property right now, Finch," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. "You do not have my authorization to touch my home." "Authorization is implied by your signing of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions," Finch replied smoothly. "It's all in the bylaws. If you refuse to comply, we will place a lien on your property." It was a nuclear option. A lien would effectively hold his house hostage. Marcus looked at the workers, at the pristine roofs of his neighbors, one of which, he noted with cold fury, had a distinct green tinge of moss. He was being financially strangled over a lie. He paid the crew to leave, a bitter pill to swallow, but a necessary one to prevent the destruction of his own roof. That evening he sat at his kitchen table, not with a book, but with a thick binder of the HOA CC&Rs. He read every line, every clause, his legal and analytical mind dissecting the labyrinthine language. He found the loopholes, the vague stipulations that gave the board unchecked power. It was a system designed for abuse. The harassment intensified. A week later, he received a formal complaint about suspicious nighttime activity, citing an unusual number of late-night visitors. The visitors were his nephew, a college student who had stayed for the weekend, and an old FBI partner, a white man, who had come for dinner. The complaint was a not-so-subtle dog whistle, painting Marcus as a source of criminal suspicion. Then came the ultimate escalation. A certified letter arrived, not a fine, but a summons. He was being called before the full HOA board for a disciplinary hearing. The charge: creating a persistent nuisance and engaging in conduct unbecoming of a Pinecrest Estates homeowner. The recommended penalty was suspension of his community amenities and, most chillingly, a formal vote on his continued eligibility to reside within the community. They weren't just fining him anymore. They were trying to evict him. The night before the hearing, Marcus didn't pace or rage. He stood in his home office, a room he had kept deliberately sparse. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a small, worn leather folio. He didn't open it. He simply held it, the weight of it familiar and formidable in his hand. He had hoped to leave this part of his life behind, to be just Marcus Thorne, homeowner. But Harold Finch and the board had left him no choice. They had mistaken his peace for weakness, his silence for surrender. They had forced the hunter out of retirement. And tomorrow, in a stuffy community clubhouse, they would finally meet the agent they had foolishly provoked. The hearing would not be his end. It would be their beginning of the end. The Pinecrest Estates clubhouse was a temple of bland conformity. Beige walls, beige carpet, a long table where the 5 members of the HOA board sat like a tribunal. Harold Finch occupied the center seat, a gavel placed pretentiously before him. The room was packed with neighbors, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and quiet judgment. They were there to witness the enforcement of order, the excision of a perceived tumor from their perfect community. Marcus Thorne entered alone. He did not slouch or hurry. He walked with the quiet, purposeful stride of a man entering a briefing room, not a kangaroo court. He took the single chair facing the board, a solitary figure against a wall of presumed authority. The air was thick with condescension. Finch began with a smarmy, theatrical sigh. Dr. Thorne, we are here today regarding numerous persistent violations of our community covenants. We have attempted reason, but you have been recalcitrant. This hearing is a final effort to bring you into compliance, before we are forced to take more severe action. He listed the charges like a prosecutor reading an indictment for treason. The welcome mat, the fern, the roof, the suspicious activity. Each accusation was met with muted nods from the board and a few whispers from the audience. They had already tried and convicted him in the court of suburban opinion. Marcus listened, his expression unreadable. He let Finch finish his grandstanding, let the man bask in his moment of perceived power. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was calm, but it carried, silencing the room. "Mr. Finch," Marcus began, "you've presented a list of trivialities, but you've failed to present the evidence that truly matters. The evidence of selective enforcement. The evidence of targeted harassment." Finch waved a dismissive hand. "We enforce the rules equally, Dr. Thorne. Do you?" Marcus asked, his tone turning icy. He stood up and pulled a tablet from his briefcase. With a few taps, he projected an image onto the wall. It was a side-by-side comparison. His front step with the single-sided fern, and Mrs. Gable's step, adorned with 3 identical plants. "No violation for her. Why?" A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Gable, sitting in the front row, flushed crimson. Another tap. His driveway crack, juxtaposed with the Patterson family's shattered pavement. "No violation for them. Why?" Finch sputtered. "Those are pending review. This is irrelevant, is it?" Marcus continued, his voice gaining a sharp forensic edge. "Or is the common denominator here the color of my skin?" The room went dead silent. The word, the accusation everyone felt, but no one dared say, now hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. "How dare you?" Finch snapped, his face mottled with rage. "This hearing is about rules, not your accusations. Your conduct is unbecoming. I call for a vote on the motion of eviction." This was it. The naked power grab. The board members, flustered but loyal to Finch, prepared to raise their hands. The triumph in Finch's eyes was vile. He believed he had won. And that was when Marcus Thorne made his move. "Before you vote," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "I think you should understand exactly who you are trying to evict. And what you are truly guilty of." He tapped his tablet again. The image changed to a formal Department of Justice seal. "My name is Dr. Marcus Thorne, but for 22 years, I was Special Agent in Charge Marcus Thorne of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A wave of shock visibly passed through the audience. Finch's jaw went slack. "My specialty," Marcus continued, his eyes locking on Finch, "was investigating complex financial crimes and public corruption. I have spent my career dismantling organizations far more sophisticated and dangerous than this little board." He let that sink in. The gavel in Finch's hand suddenly looked like a toy. "You see, Harold, when you began this campaign, I did what I am trained to do. I investigated." He advanced toward the board table, his presence now dominating the room. "I subpoenaed the HOA's financial records. I analyzed every fine, every expenditure, every special assessment you've levied over the past 5 years." He projected a new series of documents, bank statements, invoices, ledger entries that swam with red circles. What I found was fascinating. The $15,000 landscaping improvement that was actually a payment to a company owned by your brother-in-law. The mysterious legal fees that always seem to spike right before the annual meeting. The systematic overcharging for violations, with the surplus funneled into a slush fund you control. Finch was pale, sweating. "These are lies. You have no right. I have every right." Marcus's voice boomed, finally unleashing the fury he had contained for months. "You used the cover of community rules to run a criminal enterprise. You targeted me not just because I'm black, but because I was new, because you thought I was an easy mark who wouldn't fight back. You thought you were bullying a civilian. You were wrong." He turned to address the stunned neighbors. "He didn't just steal from me. He stole from all of you. Every bogus fine, every inflated cost, that was your money. He played on your desire for a perfect neighborhood to line his own pockets, and he used racism as his smokescreen." The room erupted in chaos. People stood up, shouting at the board, at Finch. The tribunal had become a riot. Marcus turned back to Finch, who was shrinking in his chair, a broken man facing an abyss he never imagined. "Your hearing is adjourned, Harold, but mine is just beginning. The U.S. Attorney's Office has all the evidence. They're particularly interested in the mail and wire fraud charges. Those carry a significant prison sentence." He leaned forward, his final words for Finch alone, a whisper that cut through the din like a knife. "You tried to have me removed from my home, but I'm the one who sends people away for a very, very long time." Marcus Thorne turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving behind a perfect community tearing itself apart. The hunter had laid his trap, and the predator had walked right into it. But the game wasn't over yet. The final, satisfying consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The fallout from the clubhouse confrontation was swift and absolute. The following days were a whirlwind of official vehicles and stunned silence on Willow Creek Lane. Agents from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, Marcus's former protégés, arrived with boxes and subpoenas. The local news, tipped anonymously, ran a story that was every HOA board's worst nightmare. FBI agent unearths corruption in perfect suburb. The narrative wasn't just about fines. It was about a racist shakedown scheme that had bled the community dry. Harold Finch was the first to be indicted. The charges were a prosecutor's dream. mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Faced with the mountain of evidence Marcus had meticulously compiled, Finch's arrogance crumbled. He pleaded guilty in a desperate bid for a lesser sentence, but his testimony, meant to save himself, only ensnared the rest of the compliant board members, revealing a network of kickbacks and collusion. The Pinecrest Estates HOA board was dismantled, replaced by an emergency committee of horrified homeowners who had finally seen the truth. The financial restitution was substantial. Every homeowner who had been unjustly fined over the previous 5 years received a check, funded by the seizure of Finch's assets. For Marcus, the money was irrelevant. The victory was in the public record, the official judgment that vindicated him completely. The lien against his property was expunged, and the HOA, under new management, formally apologized. But the true impact was written in the quiet, daily life of the neighborhood. The change was palpable. The woman with the poodle now waved warmly when she saw Marcus. The neighbor who used to stare while washing his car gave an awkward but genuine nod of respect. The fear and suspicion that Finch had cultivated had been replaced by a collective shame and a cautious desire for reconciliation. The community wasn't instantly perfect, but the poison had been purged. Marcus Thorne remained in his home on Willow Creek Lane. His sanctuary was restored, but it was different now. It was no longer just a place of retreat. It was a monument to a battle fought and won. He sat on his back deck, the lake as still as glass, and felt a peace deeper than any quiet conformity could offer. It was the peace of justice served. The story of Dr. Marcus Thorne and the Pinecrest HOA became a cautionary tale whispered in community associations across the country, a reminder that the power to govern must be tempered with fairness and transparency. But the real, powerful takeaway was simpler and far more profound. It was a lesson for every Harold Finch in the world, that the man you assume is powerless, the neighbor you dismiss as an outsider, the person you target because of the color of their skin, maybe keeping a quiet ledger of your crimes. And it was a message of hope for every person facing such injustice, that the law, when wielded by steady hands and a righteous cause, can be a shield against even the most petty and prejudiced of tyrants. The price of a peaceful home should never be your dignity. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon against a bully isn't a louder shout, but a quieter, more devastating truth. If that final moment of justice hit just right, that satisfying feeling when the corrupt get exactly what they deserve, then do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments. What was the most satisfying part of Marcus's victory for you? Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light.